Welcome, everyone, to this April 2024 Bible and Beyond discussion. I am your guest host this evening. My name is Helen Mathis. We're reversing roles for this discussion, as I'll be the host, and I have the pleasure of interviewing Shirley Paulson, who is the usual Bible and Beyond discussion host. Our topic tonight is the Canaanite woman and Shirley, interchanges with and outside the canon. Before we get to the questions, let me introduce the story of the Canaanite woman, found in Matthew 15 and Mark 7. We focused on this story because Shirley and I found lots of intriguing parallels between the story and Shirley's work of facilitating a conversation between our canonical Bible texts and those ancient texts outside our canon. The story begins with Jesus out of his element. He's in Tyre, Tyre, a foreign territory. Mark even tells us that Jesus is hiding in a house and didn't want anyone to know that he was there. However, he was accosted by a shouting Canaanite woman desperately seeking healing for her daughter. The disciples, initially irritated with the woman and acting as Jesus' bouncers or bodyguards, urged Jesus to send her away. Undeterred, the desperate woman bows down at Jesus' feet and begs for mercy. Jesus tells her he must first feed his own people, the lost sheep of Israel, and that it isn't fair to take the children's food and throw it to the dogs. The woman gives Jesus a countertext that challenges his Jewish quote-unquote canon, the accepted rules and thinking of his day. She answered him, "Sir, even the dogs eat the children's crumb that fall from the master's table." Jesus is transformed by the woman's great faith. He tells the woman, "Because of what you said, it be done for you as you wish." And her daughter was healed at that moment. The Bible and Beyond programs and offerings work in the same way when bringing together the voices of both the biblical canon and the extra-canonical texts. We will explore what this story of border crossings says to us today, as these texts, like the Canaanite woman, insist on a hearing. Is our faith able to discern the faithfulness of these ancient texts and even possibly be transformed by them? Can we hold our own sacred traditions and convictions, not in isolation, but in relation to these other ancient writings? So what I'm going to do now is ask Shirley some questions, and then we're going to ask you if you've got any questions and thoughts about and comments to add to that. But first, we're going to start with Shirley. And our first question, and this is related to the text, the story of the Canaanite woman. The first question for Shirley: did you find your initial contact with these extra-canonical material foreign, intrusive, interrupting, like Jesus found the Canaanite woman?
Oh, Helen, this is such a great topic. I'm so glad that you thought of this and you put it in connection with the whole Bible and Beyond conversation. Because, yeah, it's been quite a journey for me to get involved in these texts, and people do ask me why I'm doing it. And so you're raising some really good questions here. I appreciate this. So I would say, yes, I was instructed in my my own, religious training to beware of false teachings. And I was always alerted to check out the sources because if certain writings didn't come from an authorized source, then I might be falsely influenced and seduced into some belief that was contrary to the truth. So that was my own kind of upbringing in terms of how I relate to something that's not canonical or already established as authority. So I was taught that the voices of authority simply knew more than I did, even if I didn't understand, and I should trust that they were better informed and in a position to protect me from these false teachings. So I don't know that I thought of them as intrusive as much as I would say dangerous and wrong, and I should steer clear of them. They weren't where I should be.
And yet, Shirley, the Canaanite woman's faith is remarkable because she is a Gentile. She's inserting herself into a private home, shouting and begging for help, prostrating herself before this rabbi, this Jewish rabbi that she really doesn't know very well.
Right.
So, was it the faithfulness of these ancient voices that impelled you to persist in diving more deeply into them?
I wish I had been that mature to recognize that. I don't think I was, not at first anyway. I think what startled me the most was the discovery of ideas that were more like my own that I thought were out there. And I wanted to understand why it was so. And also I wanted to understand why they had been held back from me. So it was more about me instead of them. I wish I had had the maturity that you're talking about in terms of recognizing the value of these other voices. I wasn't there yet in the beginning. So my own response was really more about how do I evaluate them? How do I react to them? What do I think about them? Instead of hearing what they were saying, what they were offering. But I love your point that she's the one who had the faith. And I have certainly found that in the text as I've moved along, but I didn't start that way. Wish I had.
I imagine that faithfulness really came out in your dissertation work with the secret revelation of John that you brought out in your book, I think beautifully.
Yeah, that's really when I got deep into it, I just was stunned and humbled to find you're using the word faithfulness. And I think maybe with the way I looked at that was that I was finding their deep conviction in the goodness of God. And maybe that is what faithfulness means, but there's just such a rock solid foundation in spiritual conviction that I found in these texts that really did surprise me. And it did win me over. I have to agree with you that that's what made me think I need to pay attention to this. Yeah.
The disciples at the story tell Jesus to send the Canaanite woman away. Did you receive any pushback from others as you studied these texts and created your website?
Oh gosh, yes, I did. Most of my peers were not doing this. In fact, I would say hardly anybody was looking at these things with me. So it was very much alone looking at these things. I suppose most of my peers, my friends, were taught the way I was, that you shouldn't trust something that didn't come from the right authorities. And nobody had told me about these texts. So I was doubtful about them. And so I understood my peers and other people who were really pushing back against this. I was told some pretty nasty things about how I was really had been influenced by the devil specifically, and that I wasn't being faithful to what I'd been taught, and that I was, several ways of looking at that I was also just dealing with a fluff. It didn't have any meaning. So it was like I got a lot of that kind of opposition to it. And I think that I understood them just because I had already been there myself. But yeah.
But you persisted.
Yeah, well, thank you. I am glad I did too, because there was something very compelling about what I was finding in these texts that said, this is something I need to look into more. I really felt, as you've pointed out, that there was a beautiful faithfulness in the voices of these people, the writers, that I had no idea was there. So I was drawn to it, and I wanted to find out more about why it was there. And also, I couldn't help but ask, why was it hidden? What was preventing the rest of the world from looking at these and being taught the way I was, that they were dangerous and they were wrong. And I really was taught to trust that boundary that was built for me. So I had quite a struggle with that myself, which is what made me understand other people who felt that I was doing evil to deal with that boundary, the Canon boundary. Yeah.
So the Canaanite woman was a hint of things to come in the Jesus movement, in that very soon there would be Gentiles knocking on their doors, looking for healing and presenting counter narratives, just like the Syrophoenician woman, the Canaanite woman. Do you see your own work of sharing these texts with the public as contributing to the opening up of new communities of faith and expanding horizons?
Wow, that's quite a deep question, Helen. It's typical of you. I think that there are several elements to that question that are worth thinking about. It seems to imply that by opening the doors, others would have the opportunity to gain more faith or something. But to be honest, I really didn't have that motive at first. I think the more I learned of what others were thinking, the more I realized the arrogance that I was dealing with. I mean, I hate to put Jesus in my shoes like that, but if he was feeling arrogant, I was definitely feeling arrogant. And I didn't recognize their faithfulness at first. My motive in opening the door was to have them come into my door. But I think I've come to learn that whenever doors are open, they should have a two-way passage, that you should be able to use a door that goes in and out instead of just a one-way passage. And that is, I recognize that I need to be as willing to step outside as much as I want to welcome others to come inside. I guess otherwise you could say I'm like running a vacuum cleaner, sucking people in rather than a doorway that opens the people to choose to come in and me to choose to have conversations in and out. So anyway, with that caveat, I would say yes, opening the doors really does expand horizons for everybody. And I think it does deepen the faith. The wonderful thing about hearing others is that you hear their questions and their objections, and when you listen to their questions, it helps me anyway. It helps me understand my own faith better. It helps me to learn how to communicate ideas that are useful to others just because I know where they're coming from. And I know what I have that's valuable, but I need to know how to say it in a way that has meaning to other people. And same thing with them. The more I listen, the more I understand they're saying something that's a gift to me too. So that's what I mean by the two-way door that's opening. And so yes, your wording about expanding the horizons, I think is well put, that it does. It helps everybody see more and learn more that way.
Your story reminds me, Shirley, of when I was overseas. My best friend was Indian, from India. She was a Hindu. And I just remember thinking how high and moral her values were. Even though they weren't Christian, they were the same kind of similar values, but in different language, in the same way that we're often unfamiliar with the language within our text. And to be able to recognize another person's faithfulness and integrity, or a missionary going overseas to teach or implant or inculcate Christianity, and yet finding the Christian values, but not under the name of Christian, or under different languages. It's a very similar kind of effect, I think.
Yeah, I like the way you're talking about the language question, because language isn't just words that are translated to another word. Their language has to do with a whole way of living, the context in which you understand your values of life. And that's why the words don't translate from one to another in any language. And that this idea of hearing others who have a different set of context and language to convey their religious experience is really about, it's about the language, understanding each other's whole story that comes with the language. that's the part that surprised me, I think, the most when I was learning to listen to others, was that I couldn't just argue from my point of view what they're doing and not doing. I had to really learn how to get in their shoes and walk with them to know how to communicate, both with the open door.
Yeah. And this actually brings me to another very brief story. When we took our daughter to Africa, a lot of her friends here said, they were afraid that she would forget that she was an American. And so my question is, has this new knowledge of these counter narratives or all the other narratives and the scholarship that has opened them up threatened your own convictions, your own sense of who you are?
Yeah, well, before I answered that, what happened to your daughter? Did she lose it, or what happened to her?
She became actually quite aware that she was an American, and there was lots of going on in the world that were involved with the American, participating in that, in the U.S. participating in that. So and she was often on the defensive or on the offensive, depending upon what was being shared. But she was much more aware of her heritage and her American citizenship because she was out and about.
Yeah, I would think that that's exactly how I experienced this foreign language of other religious thoughts also. It's so strange that these ancient texts were actually more similar to the ideas that I had grown up with than I envisioned. At first, the language, the words were so different because I never heard them before. But once I listened to what they meant and how people used them and lived them, I thought, I could live in that world. I could live with their just changing the nuances of words a bit more, but it told me that I'm at home with those words, with that language. And it also made me then, therefore, I think going back to your point, is it made me recognize that my own set of truisms or reality was actually deepened by stretching my vocabulary, if you will, or stretching my view of what that means and how others can live it and understand it. So, I would say it really gave me deeper roots in where I am. I've lived with these ideas my whole life in a deep way. I've always been very drawn to spiritual ideas and their practical use, which is why I studied practical theology in my PhD work. But it also contributes to healing. I feel like healing is an outcome of that kind of conviction. So I noticed in myself when I've been wrestling with these things that these things have actually deepened my conviction, strengthened my faith in my own healing work, my healing activities, to the point where I feel like this has actually been better for me in giving me confidence in what I'm doing than weakening. I will say, though, on this question, I'm aware of many people who go to seminary, and my fellow seminarians especially, who lost their faith in seminary, and they felt like they were studying things that made them lose faith in what they had already known, but then they didn't have anywhere to go. So some people seem to get stronger faith, some people lose their faith. From my experience, I remember one day when I was especially shaken because several things that I had believed were exposed as being probably not true. And then I thought, well, then how do I know what I know if these things aren't true? Then what is true? How do I know what's true? And I had to come back to my own experience to see that what I was leaning on was I guess the healing effect of what I was doing that was real. It wasn't just theory. And so that's what made me keep checking what I was leaning on. And then that's why I think that the ideas that kept strengthening that is what deepened my faith. Whereas I think others who hadn't had the kind of experience with I guess just putting it into practice, didn't know where else to turn. And they're the ones who kind of felt like, okay, this is all imaginary. It's just that there's nothing to this. It's just all in your head somewhere. And so they would lose faith. So it's an interesting kind of testing time to find out, what are you leaning on, and on what basis are you leaning on these things? And for me, the bigger the conversation, the deeper my roots.
And, that's a great segue to the actual story, because it was the experience of Jesus in a situation that he was not familiar with that transformed him.
Yeah.
Where the woman literally imposed herself into the household and made Jesus experience her in a way that he hadn't done before, and it transformed him. And so that's a combination of and he didn't lose his own convictions. He still held his convictions, but they were expanded and put in conversation with a wider sense of what he believed, and whether he could accommodate that woman. And then the whole movement that happened to the whole movement as well, where their experience of being outside in the world with Paul's Gentiles, the Apostle Paul's Gentiles, that experience is what transformed them.
That's such a very helpful thought, Helen, because you're right. I think I can relate better to where Jesus was with his experience, because of the experience I've already had, and what Jesus was also leaning on, that he knew his healing authority. He knew that. So when he recognized that this woman was faithful, but also receptive to this particular way of thinking, he was able to support her that way, and recognize and said to her, this is your faith. This makes sense to me. I get this. So that's beautiful, the way that transformed him. And it's also a nice way to understand the way the two-way door is working, because she was able to walk in and he was able to walk out of that door. And so that's the way I think I have learned also, that by opening that door, and learning how to find what the faith of others does help them find, I suppose, a place with the things I'm sharing in my experience, but also for me to learn from them, transforming me too. It's a great word.
Yeah. And these extra canonical texts are in the household now, in our day. They're there, they're present, and we've got to talk to them.
I love it, Helen. Yes, they are. This is,
Can't ignore them.
They may not be bound up in the same Bible I carried around all my life, but they are online. They are in books. It translated into English in many, many ways. So we really don't have any excuses to hide from them anymore. That's a really good point. They've been discovered. They've been brought to the world in English in a way that we really do need to work with them.
So Jesus was in a foreign land when the woman found him. In a sense, he had to acknowledge his location and the social dynamic of their exchange in order to interact with her and discern her faith.
Yeah.
What do you see as the role of critical thinking and context in opening up these extra canonical texts?
Oh, Helen, that's another really great question, because you're right. And this was a hard part for me, because I know that I intentionally went to seminary for the purpose of learning the language and the meaning of other Christians, because I knew we weren't communicating. So I wanted them to understand me. And I did not envision that I had very much to learn from others, because I thought I already had the sources I needed for learning everything I needed to learn. So I was not planning to learn anything from them. I was only trying to learn where they are so I could, bring them to me. So I had a major, I think transformation is a very good word, because that is what happened to me. It took me a while to recognize that I was really occupying space in a foreign land, and that it was strange. But the admission that I was in this foreign land, which is again a nice word that you're using, made me recognize I was actually more at home with the very things that this country did not like. In other words, the extra canonical writings. So that meant that in order to communicate, which is what I wanted to do, I needed to not only learn their language and understand it from their point of view, but also understand from their point of view what they were upset about, what was disturbing to people, why they didn't like the kinds of things that I was so excited about. And that's where the critical thinking really came in, because I had to really learn to what's the right word? Is it judge? I don't know. Evaluate, critically look at why I was saying what I was saying and why others are saying what they're saying. And it's that critical thinking that made me find the ways to actually open the door, the ways to actually say, okay, here's some facts for us all to think about together. Here's some things that aren't making sense together. What are we going to do about them? So the critical thinking helped me to get over my own wrong approach and to actually find the valuable means for the, I don't know if the word blessing is the right word, but the benefits of hearing and speaking at the same time.
So I'll ask one more question here, Shirley, about to continue this. Does the word scholarship scare you, or did it scare you? And how do you partner your spirituality and your spiritual practice with scholarship? I mean, why is it useful to you? A lot
Yeah,
of people find it threatening.
well, yes, and that's partly where I was shunned at first when I was getting into this, was that people accused me of thinking that scholarship was going to take over or obstruct my own spiritual strength and where I've come from. So scholarship, I think, was used in a way to threaten me, but I hadn't even intended on getting involved in scholarship. I was only going to get involved in learning the language. But then as I got into it, I realized, oh, this is what scholarship is. It is the critical thinking. So I wasn't afraid of it as much as I found others who were warning me about what was wrong. And I think when I was trying to describe what happened to my fellow seminarians in terms of some falling away from the faith and others getting deeper into it, that word scholarship is in the middle of it. Because when scholarship takes over, it becomes more of the end rather than the means to an end, then I think that scholarship then can be confusing, because where are you going with it? If you don't know what you're actually looking for, you can go forever and ever down rabbit holes that don't go anywhere. And so I agree that there's a problem with scholarship if it doesn't have any, doesn't lead you to something that's meaningful or useful. But on the other hand, scholarship is necessary for critical thinking, which is the very thing that enables us to engage with one another. And as you were pointing out in the story with the Canaanite woman, to actually recognize her faith, her value, her meaning, and therefore how Jesus was able to connect with her in a way that was meaningful to her as well as for him, for the blessing to go both ways in that case. I would think that they would have called that scholarship, but it was certainly a way of opening up the thought on both ends.
And I would say scholarship also helps with the language, because it helps to understand the words and the social and religious context. And I think also scholarship for me helped me put me back in the antiquity, so that I could actually understand their situation better. So that was helpful too. Let's open it up. It's now 5:30. I've got a couple more questions, but I'll wait. We'd like to hear from you all. If you have any questions for Shirley, or comments or experiences that you would like to share, we would love to hear from you.
Oh, there. Okay. I mean, what was your breakthrough into contacting these non-canonical texts? Into contacting them? I think the question means what made me go ahead and do it? Is that what the question means? I want to make sure I'm understanding what you're asking. What really startled me and got me deep into it, if I'm answering you correctly, is that when I recognized that these texts were speaking a deep truth to something I had not ever seen anywhere else. It's not that it didn't, it's not that I was missing it before, but they were expanding my understanding of it. And I had a very small picture of what was going on in antiquity. I had heard that healing, for example, was going on in antiquity, but that it died out in the 3rd century. But the more I got into what was actually going on, like Helen was talking about, when you get into the world of antiquity, you find out so much more about the context of what was happening and why people were talking the way they did. And these extra canonical texts brought me deep into that world in a way that opened up my thought about it. I don't know if I'm answering that question, but that was what got me. So now I see more questions. Should I take these, Helen, or do you want to guide me?
Go ahead, Shirley.
Okay, so it looks like Joy is next then.
Thank you so much for putting this together in with a story that a lot of us are all really recognize who aren't academics in the religious field, but have studied the Bible a lot, and showing how your experience is that way. I really see that Canaanite and Jesus experience as a real interfaith situation. And as you were saying, it was important about knowing language. And one of the things that when I studied these passages, the commentary that I was pointing out said that Jesus, well, this is what I was getting at, it was that Jesus was talking to this woman, voicing the traditional Jewish attitude towards Canaanites, in saying that, this is really for the Jewish people, it's not for anybody else. He was voicing that, where the woman had come in and all of his disciples were shunning him and shunning her and not having any conversation, didn't communicate with her. So he verbalized what they were thinking. It was how I looked at that, and gave her the opportunity to come back and say and demand that this is not just for the Jewish people, but something more. And then when he says, it's not right to give this, truth, these teachings to the dogs,
Right.
which sounded very insulting. The word he used for dogs was not the wild dogs running around scrounging and being dangerous, but the household pets. And so when he said that, it sounded like an affront, but she, in her language, heard him saying, like you are a loved, welcomed person at our table, not necessarily on top of the table, but under the table. But she picked it up where his disciples might not have, because they would not necessarily have known the language and the communication. And that encouraged her to really, really say, I know that what you're teaching is not just for the Jewish people, but it is for all people. And that was what he was going, wow, you've got it. And of course, then what she was expecting was available to her and her daughter had a healing. So I really like that sense that it's so important to learn the language and to be able to communicate rather than just set off and go, I don't believe what you say. A real interfaith conversation has to understand the other language and to be willing to engage with them. So thank you.
Oh, thank you, Joy. That's wonderful. I have not heard about the kind of dog that she was talking about. That's very interesting. Thank you. And looks like Sarah's next.
When I was first studying in seminary, this story was brought out to be one of the best ways to compare the way stories are told in the different Gospels. Whether you call her a Syrophoenician woman or a Canaanite woman is a significant difference. And the fact in Mark that he was there absolutely alone, without his disciples. He went into hiding. But in Mark, the bouncers are with him. I mean, in Matthew, the bouncers are with him. There are a number of differences there that, although it's pretty obvious that it's the same experience, but told from such emphasizing such different aspects of the story, I guess is what I mean. That it's a tremendous learning tool, both for Bible study and for personal growth.
Can I just say something, Shirley, really quickly about that?
Yeah.
Is that all right?
Yeah.
And the really interesting point, Sarah, in that the fact that in Matthew, where the bouncers are there, that Matthew is writing in 80 of the Common Era, about 50 years after Jesus. And at that point, the Gentiles are at the door, yelling and asking for help and giving a counter narrative. And that the Matthew story is told in a way that will help that community accept those Gentiles. And to have Jesus actually be transformed in the process of this conversation, he becomes a model for that Matthew community in 80 to be also transformed by opening their doors and letting these people in.
That's fascinating. And so, Helen, how would you say?
Scholarship.
Yeah, I was just going to say, wonderful scholarship, Sarah, to bring out the difference between these Gospels and to show that they have a different reason for saying what they're saying. So then how would you say, either one of you, what was Mark about then if Jesus was hiding? What do you take from that then?
Well, in the whole Gospel of Mark, he's hiding. He's telling people, I'll heal you, but don't tell anybody. Of course, they go off and blab. Don't tell anybody. Don't tell anybody. And the disciples are so stupid in Mark. They just don't get it. They don't get it. The only people that get it are the demons that are, that he's casting out. They know who he is. So it kind of goes along with that whole thing and of course, in Mark, you're just so conscious of the pressure that the man has been under. These events just happen. And you think, well, maybe he needed a break, And I have no point of view of which story is right or wrong, where the disciples were really there and they just weren't emphasized in Mark, or if Matthew added them for his particular audience to be helped. But it's just a fascinating pair of stories telling the same thing.
I love the way you just now brought out the fact that you don't have to choose which one is right.
No, you don't. It's the way all the way through the Gospels.
Well, I think you're bringing out a really important part that fits into this question Helen's asking in the first place, which is how do you engage with these things that are just not set in stone and this is the way it is, but you're having to stretch to deal with this. And so even though these are canonical writings you're talking about, they're still different.
Yes.
But how do we come to terms with something that's different from something else? And I think what you're doing that's very helpful there is to show that this gospel has a very important insight to bring. This gospel has another very important point to bring. Even though they're talking about the same story, they're telling something that's important to think about in both stories. I think that's what I get out of the extra canonical writings, is that they're not telling me this is the truth and that's not the truth. It's saying, here's a very important point. It may relate to what you've already thought about, but in another way, and you can see more about what you're thinking about just by understanding the multiple stories. Very helpful. Yeah.
So I'm going to throw something in for you really quickly, Shirley. So would these extra canonical texts be devalued compared to the canon? Should they just be crumbs under the table in relationship to the canon?
Oh my gosh.
or can we bring them up and sit them at the same table to have a good conversation?
That's a really good question. I would like to just think about that for a little bit, because this is part of the pushback I got back in the beginning. Why are you doing this? Because it's outside the boundaries. Somebody set the boundaries for you to be just right. So you have to think about, well, why are you looking outside the boundaries? And I feel like what I've learned here is that the reason those boundaries were set in the first place was not because they came out of the sky from God and said, this is the boundary. It's because people at a certain time were trying to guide people to their best way of understanding ideas at the time. And so these boundaries took a long time to be organized. And those boundaries are also not the same boundaries from all Christians, even today. So they're different people at different times who have set the boundaries. So having a sense that these boundaries are not concrete walls that God sent, I've been more interested in thinking about, why would this be not inside that concrete wall? And why is this, in, why is this out? And it helps me to understand more about, again, the movement of thought over the centuries, rather than I shouldn't look at it. So I think the question, I'm just asking different questions when I look at these extra canonical writings. Instead of saying, is this bad or wrong? I'm asking, what is it telling me about the early Christian thought? And what I've discovered is that many of these early texts that were written before the boundaries even were conceived of are the very ones that are expanding my own thought more than the ones that became sort of codified. And, I think you have to remember that the New Testament only has 27 books. Some of them are tiny. And after the Nag Hammadi discoveries, and even the ones at Oxyrhynchus, we now have over 100 texts that tell us something about Jesus. And so there's so much more to be thinking about than I think we've seen only by looking inside the canon. So I think the canon, if you understand it as a guide from some people at a certain time who are trying to help people think what's helpful to study, that's a good way to think about what the canon is.
That's great. Well, it's Annie's turn. Annie, would like to ask your question?
Hi, Shirley. Thanks for this conversation, and Helen too. I have just one comment about the Syrophoenician story regarding the Mark and Matthew versions. Mark was mainly written for the Gentiles, so the discussion with the disciples was not necessary to the discussion to the Gentiles. They just didn't have a reason for having that discussion. And so I think that's why Mark did not include it.
Well, this is kind of off. I'm really enjoying this conversation, by the way, Helen and Shirley. It's wonderful. When we talked at the beginning about the Canaanite woman, and this being kind of the first time Jesus was dealing with that, I think back to the centurion who asked for Jesus to come and heal his servant. I was thinking that was earlier in the chronology, if we really know what the chronology is.
Possible.
Yeah, I don't know.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's earlier in those books, but I don't know if it really was earlier.
It's a good example. Thank you.
Yeah, but another place where someone else recognized the purity of what Jesus had and the power of it.
I think one difference between those two would be that the centurion was in Jewish territory.
Right. That's
and
true.
So Jesus was encountering him as a known quantity, and he was among his people. And then when he's out in Tyre, it's sort of the reverse of that. Whatever the chronology, they're just two different types of encounters.
Right.
Yeah, and we know that the centurion was commended to Jesus because he had contributed to the I don't know, not the synagogue, but contributed to their community, their Jewish community. So he was already a contributor, even if he wasn't Jewish himself.
But that does point out the vulnerability of Jesus in this Canaanite story, in the same way that we're vulnerable when we open up, and that's actually can be a place of opportunity.
Yeah, very interesting.
Becky, do you want to go next?
Yeah, I feel like some of mine's been covered already, but just to say that it helps me to realize that anyone telling this story really has the best of intentions, and they just may have different intentions. For instance, Matthew may want to be sure that his Jewish audience knows that there was 2 witnesses for each of these events, as opposed to Mark, that was not as important as seeing other aspects of it. And then when you look at other canonical writings, that they may be coming yet from another approach. That helps me. And what you said at the start, Shirley, about being sure about where your faith is. I used to be heavily involved with the Biblical Archaeology Society and a little bit involved with the Society for Biblical Literature. So many of my friends, the ones that this was their life purpose, lost their faith as they dug deeper.
Yeah.
Now, they kind of went through stages. Some went to Judaism first, since it was the first thing, and then some lost the Judaism. And that made me back off a little bit. And then as I met other members and realized, as we could accept our faith, then we can look at artifacts and not fall apart if they don't substantiate one thing or another. They're interesting, and they help expand what we know about biblical times, and realize we're not reading perfect literature, perfect stories. These were people living real lives, and they were struggling to figure out if there really was one God. And just in case they're not, I'm going to keep this God of fertility in the back room, just in case. So
Yeah. Well,
that's all. I appreciate the discussion today. It's really been good.
good. Well, I like the way you're bringing out the different reasons for why they're doing what they're doing, and the fact that you don't have to agree with it, but it's helpful to hear them. I think that's kind of the one of the biggest surprises that I had myself in learning these things was that I felt like there's one truth, I had it, and everyone else was going to find it out too. And I learned that there were many interpretations of Jesus. Yes, there's one Jesus, but there are many ways that people understood him, and they were valuable to where the people were. So the people in the first century who lived in Jerusalem were different from the people who lived in the first century in Egypt or the second century in Rome or whatever. So people had different reasons for understanding Jesus in a different way. So that also opened up my thought too, to how to hear people. I'm not needing to squeeze them into my truth in order to make truth out of the reality of Jesus, but rather to understand Jesus from a broader point of view.
When I'm so involved in interfaith, it may not even be Jesus.
Right. Yeah. Right. Well, my work had brought me into understanding Jesus.
Yeah, I understand.
But the issue is like, where's truth? Where's God? Where's the reality?
What is truth? Exactly.
Yeah.
What is truth and where is it?
Yeah. Right. My house. In my box. Right. Okay.
In my book.
In my book.
Right.
Anna, would you want to come forward with your question?
I was sort of interested in the people dropping out. I think they got involved in scholarship for confirmation bias to confirm what they believed, and they found out there were things they never heard before, and that scared them. And oh no, there's something beyond this, and I can't stand it. I can't take it. I'm going to get out. Something like that.
Definitely. I think that, well, first of all, seminaries are open to a lot of different ways of approaching them. One style of seminary is to say, learn everything that's out there. Another style says, I'm shaping you to think this particular way so that you can graduate and be affirmed as a believer in this particular way. And you're right, people would drop out of that kind of strict guidance because they found that it was just didn't fit with the larger picture that they were learning. But I think that most people who would drop out would be because they lost faith in anything. They just tended to not know where to go with a faith that was confusing. But you're right, I mean, and then like I'm saying, that seminaries can be open to embracing wherever you come from, and others can say, no, it's got to be this way, or else you don't belong here. I was in a school that had mixed. Some of my professors were happy to open the door for me. Others said, you do not belong here. So it just kind of depends on the seminary and the professor and all those different kinds of different categories of the way people teach this.
Okay, hi, it's Leanne. I'm very new to all of this. I just in the last few months have found out about this organization, and I've known that there were the Gnostic texts and stuff, but I've just really started learning more about how much there is out there that's extra canonical. And so I'm really thrilled with the discussion, and I feel quite humbled by all of the knowledge that there is in this group. So thank you for having me. I wanted to ask a question. There 2 or 3 times tonight, there's been the comment made that Jesus was transformed by the Canaanite woman's statement. And I've always felt like there was so much more to the story than what's in the Gospels and in the Bible in general. But I've also kind of felt like there had to have been, I don't think Jesus just was plopped down and he had all the knowledge and understanding and everything all at once. Like, it just was given to him and he saw everything and knew everything. But that he had his own struggles and his own growing that needed to be done. Is that what I'm hearing from you all as well? And is that supported by the early Christian texts?
That was such a great question, Leanne. Thank you for bringing your willingness to think and learn to this group. This is what we're about. So thank you for the question. As far as whether Jesus learned something or not, that's a huge debate in the scholarly world, because the more orthodox view would say, well, since Jesus is God, God doesn't have to learn anything. God already knows everything. So it's a huge question about why God would be rude to a woman who's asking for healing, and that God didn't need to learn anything. So that question, that whole story is a big problem. And then others would say Jesus was a human who was born from a human mother as an infant and then grew up and learned things. And then by the time he was 30, he was mature enough to handle a mission and so forth. And so therefore he went through a learning process. And then therefore we can think about how Jesus could have been transformed by this experience. So this is a very, very good example of the kind of scholarship that goes into looking at a story like this. You can look at it and say, it doesn't fit the model of Jesus already being God and knowing everything. So do we say, therefore, that the story is telling us that Jesus learned something? Or are we going to dismiss the story and say it just doesn't fit, so we just think it must not be right? So these are the kinds of questions that critical thinking brings to it. And that's a very, very good question. My own opinion is that Jesus learned something and that Jesus was transformed. And I think the reason I feel that way is that my own experience was so much like that. It rings true to me. So it's kind of the way I come to terms with that kind of a question. But you have to make space for people who think of Jesus as already the God who can't learn something, who already knows everything. And so making space for that just means that you understand where people are coming from when they balk at that kind of a story.
Well, and I also think it's not a single thing. It's not either he learned or he already knew. It could be somewhere in between. And it's really about what is that writer trying to communicate to the readers or the listeners.
And that's what I really learned in seminary because of the academics, the scholarship, is that these stories are as much about Jesus as they are about the community behind the gospel when it was written.
Yeah.
They really are 50-50.
Yeah. Beautiful. Well, Helen, we think we better close out the hour here. It's so much fun.
I want to thank you. This has been a fantastic conversation, and you've all contributed so many good ideas and including your own experiences. So thank you for participating. So this has been the April 2024 Bible and Beyond discussion titled The Canaanite Woman and Shirley, Interchanges with and Outside the Canon with Dr. Shirley Paulson. Once a month from 8 to 9 Eastern Time on Monday nights, usually the 4th of the month, the Bible and Beyond discussion invites a scholar to talk about one or more early Christian texts. The scholar provides a well-framed overview of an early Christian text and allows participants to ask questions and share their insights. So Shirley, why don't you tell us what's happening next month?
Yeah, well, next month, first of all, I have to say that this time is going to be again on the third Monday. We've had several of this going on this year. And the reason we're doing this on the third Monday is that the fourth Monday will be Memorial Day. So check your calendars for the third Monday for next time. Dr. James McGrath will be with us to talk about his new studies on John the Baptist. And even though he's such a well-known biblical figure, this is John I'm talking about, few people really know about his life. And that's what we'll be talking about. So I also just want to join Helen and thank you so much, Helen, for the wonderful questions that you've been asking tonight and everybody else who's joined us tonight. We look forward to seeing you on May 20th. Thanks, everyone.